And let's see, test speed. Yes,
You
that's,
got it.
oh yes, they caught you on that one. All right, well, let's begin. I got a sidetrack for us here. Um, First of all, The Simpsons. I've been talking about things you've been watching and been a fan of for all of these long years. I started watching The Simpsons way back, like in 89 or 90. You know, it was like the thing. And so, anyway, one of the things that I noticed pretty much from the beginning was that The Simpsons always had like art history references in the show somewhere somehow. Sometimes they'd go big, sometimes it would just be a little thing off in the corner. And as somebody who studied art history, I do that with movies too, and TV shows and stuff. I see what's hanging on the wall, when even in the news, when they're talking to people on Zoom, I'm looking around to see what books they read and what art they have. So anyway, I thought I'd show you this. And this was a good picture on my phone. It's not very high res, but that was from The Simpsons, and this is a very famous painting by Edward Hopper called Nighthawks from 1942. And so that's what they're referencing here. Nighthawks, first of all, you can see it at the Art Institute in Chicago, the Museum of the Art Institute. That's where it's at. Second thing is that this painting has been kind of remade in all kinds of ways. Like this show turned her into Marilyn Monroe, Humphrey Bogart, Elvis Presley, it's, stuff. Anyway, very famous painting. And why do I look for this stuff? Well, because it's there. And I just wanted to kind of make the point that if you are in the arts, you most definitely will be taking classes like this. Whether you're a designer, a painter, a filmmaker, a cartoonist, you're in animation, whatever. And so it's kind of like an inside club. And so filmmakers put like really cool paintings on the wall of their stage sets. And people that do animation, like Matt Groening, the inventor of The Simpsons, does the same thing. And so this, another low res, Homer Simpson, there's Bart. And this is the painting. This is in the book too. The Death of Marat by Jacques Louis David. And it's a painting about the French Revolution. And Marat actually was some guy that had a skin disease, and he had to soak in a tub for many hours. See, this is a tub, and it's covered up, and so anyway, a femme fatale. A woman came in and stabbed him right through the chest. And there he is. And there's the knife down there. And so anyway, that's, in this case, Homer Simpson. This is something we'll be looking at pretty soon. And one of you chose this for quiz one. I forgot who.
I did.
Mia. Yeah, that's right. The creation of Adam. The creation of Bart Simpson.
Did you know Bart Simpson's voiced by a woman?
Say what?
Bart Simpson's voice actor is a woman.
Yeah, it's like Angela Cartwright.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good.
Well, she didn't have to worry about her voice changing too, which was
Yeah.
like so brilliant. Yeah. And there's the real one. Famous painting, Edvard Munch. The Scream. He's got his family there in the background. And there's the real Scream by Edvard Munch. Late 19th century, Norwegian, very famous painting. I thought this was going to be better too. It's low res. Anyway, there's Lisa Simpson, and she's looking at this abstract painting that looks like this in real life. It's by John Moreau, and it's titled 1934. And that's something that abstract artists of the day like to do. Not always, but often. They would give their paintings a title like maybe the year or the date or something else. And it was basically because they felt like titles caused you to see the picture in a particular sort of way. We'll talk about that later when we get to the 20th century. But most famously, the Dali, Persistence of Memory, 1931, and the real one. And this you can see at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And preview, this is in the book too. And it's really not very big. You see posters of it and it's like really big and it's like 30 inches across or something.
Isn't the Mona Lisa also really small?
Yes, yes it is. And this right here is a twofer. This is Homer Simpson as Vincent van Gogh's self-portrait. And this is a reference to Giorgio de Chirico's Mystery and Melancholy of the Street from the early 20th century. And there's the Van Gogh. And there's the Mystery and Melancholy of the Street, and the shadow shines of Marge Simpson goes right there. And there is Springstonian Museum where the elite meet Magritte, which is kind of funny. This here, this is an Alexander Calder. I didn't get that one. I got slacked on that. But this is Magritte, and he is a surrealist. And oh shoot, I forgot the name. It's like the Mystery of the Normal or something of that nature. But you can see the artist looking at the egg and painting the bird. And there you go. Even the Simpsons have illustrated history of Western art. And we've got this. Just say. And so let me get to this. And this is a Renaissance in Quattrocento, 1400s, 15th century. And so we looked at a lot of this already. I just wanted to show you a few more things. The last time we were here, we, oh, got it. Total disclosure. I put this recording of our class on YouTube and the BBC blocked it because this James Burke Point of View is owned by BBC. It's like 30 years old, but no. So anyway, I did have a Zoom recording of the class, and that's what's on the media gallery. So we beat the spread. Masaccio to tribute money with perspective lines. Masaccio was one of the great painters of the early Italian Renaissance. And one of the things I almost feel compelled to say, I do. One of the things that kind of accompanies the Renaissance, especially the Italian Renaissance, is that we really know the names of the artist, even though, as you can see, it's not signed or anything. But we know the names of these artists, and there was a guy named Giorgio Vasari who in the 15th century, or the 16th century, excuse me, wrote the biographies of the great painters, sculptors, and architects. And in some quarters, that's considered the first art history book. We know who some of the artists were before this time, and a lot of them we don't know. We just know that there's this statue in the Gothic cathedral, but we don't really know who made it. And a lot of times we don't even know the architects of some of the great cathedrals too. These were engineers and architects, but they worked for the church, and they didn't seek any notoriety, fame, credit for what they did. But that's starting to change here. And anyway, Giorgio Vasari wrote about Masaccio. And Masaccio was a crazy man. He was a guy that would get drunk and get into fights and do all kinds of bad behavior. But he was an artist, so, you know, they cut him some slack. And Masaccio, the Holy Trinity, and somebody wrote about this too, I'm happy to say. And this is with the perspective. And we saw this, more perspective, and even more perspective. And we saw Fra Angelico back in the old style, but an artist in his own right. And so, here we go. I'll start here. The Last Supper, mural in the refectory Convent of St. Apollonia, Florence, Italy. And so we see perspective. It is the art style of the day. And I showed you this last time, more perspective, but we're not putting this vanishing point on Christ. We're starting to sacrifice some of this symbolism for realism. And so Della Francesca, I told you about these guys. This was the style, the standard of portraiture in 15th century Florence. And as you can see, and you can see this in Northern Europe, and you can see it in Italy, oftentimes the frame is as artistic as the paintings themselves. And so, just saying. Della Francesca, Madonna Madonna enthroned, mask. Um, and so, yeah, all of these things, this is another time where Della Francesca is kind of spanning the ages. And there are some ideas about who these people are. And these are some 15th century monks. And this is obviously the Madonna, the Child, and that red thing there, that's left over. That's a flaw. But we also have a knight here. And we think that knight is this guy. Notice the resemblance? Federico Montefeltro. So yeah, you pay for paintings, you want to get your face in it. And what we see here more and more, and this is later 15th century, we start to see a lot of that detail that the Northern painters were all about. We start to see that here. And how can they do that? Oil on wood. So we have this interchange between the Northern Renaissance and the Southern Renaissance. I'm telling you this little bit of history, FYI, for your information. For many decades, scholars considered the Italian Renaissance to be the true Renaissance and considered the Northern Renaissance to be primitive. Actually, my guy, David Hockney, made a reference to that. He said, they call these guys primitive, but there was nothing primitive about this at all. Of course, David Hockney's art history classes were probably 60 years ago. My art history classes were 40 years ago or less, 35. Anyway, bottom line is that attitude still persisted. Today, we don't place one over the other. We just draw geographical distinction. We talk about them separately still. And it's my belief that sometime in the not too distant future, we'll just look at the Renaissance more holistically. What's going on in Northern Europe and what's going on in Italy. And in part because we're finding out that there was much more interaction between those two cultures, those two civilizations, and art history evolves. It catches up with itself. The researchers, and so anyway, just saying, and the reason I'm telling that is because when you do research, you might find an old source that will refer to somebody like John Van Eyck as a primitive, and was not primitive at all. Ghirlandaio, this is a fresco. You can see it has considerably less detail, but it's still pretty sophisticated. And the one thing that Hockney was talking about the patterns following the folds, see, they're getting it. This is late 15th century. And again, the stylish portraiture always in profile in Renaissance, early Renaissance Italy. And so oil and tempera on wood. And then we come to the end of the 15th century, the end of the 1400s, and there's a guy who emerges who kind of sets the stage for high Renaissance, and that's this guy here, Sandro Botticelli. And you can see he's breaking with a lot of the traditions. You will see this portrait, and just like Federico of Urbino profile, and here, Botticelli, man holding a medallion of Cosimo de' Medici. And it's not profile, and it's very naturalistic. And so this guy comes along and kind of modernizes or does make some advances in Italian art. One of the things here too that's kind of interesting, you see it's not that elaborate, but he has created a landscape in the back. And there's a couple of things that's noticeable. One is that it gets less in focus as you go into the back, as you go deeper in space. And the other is that it changes color. That change of color is called atmospheric perspective. Now, the guy who would perfect that is Leonardo da Vinci. But Botticelli is, like I say, setting the stage for the high Renaissance. One of the things that's starting to happen too, and this is part of the high Renaissance, is that they start to openly embrace pre-Christian iconography, pre-Christian beliefs. And so this whole thing here, this whole picture, it's got an angel, it's got Cupid. He's going to shoot the arrow and make maybe these women fall in love with this guy or something. Bottom line is that it was no longer taboo to make paintings of Greco-Roman gods, goddesses, and mythology. Before this time, you could have gone to prison for doing something like that. What would have happened is that you would be considered a heretic. That was considered pagan, and that's not something you do because it violates Christianity. So they're easing up on this. And Primavera, spring, but this is, I put the star on this one, the birth of Venus. Venus, Roman goddess of beauty and love. It's the Roman equivalent to Aphrodite. And there she is, the birth of Venus coming in on a shell. Has her attendant there with this very elaborate blanket, gonna throw it over her, and you got these two, they are sort of the gods, the angels, blowing the wind. But let me tell you about that. They started this idea of going back to ancient Greece and Rome. It's part and parcel of the Italian Renaissance. They had been looking around and they were finding a lot of things from ancient times, and it was far advanced, much more advanced than where they were, especially in the terms of science and math and geography and a lot of things. And so those who had money, they were buying up a lot of these ancient Greek and ancient Roman artifacts, texts, books, and they really admired what the ancients had done. And they came to this conclusion, which is the justification for all of this paganism resurfacing in art. And that is, they theorized that there were signs in ancient mythology that actually predicted Christianity. And so they looked to the Roman, Greco-Roman goddesses, Aphrodite, Venus, and making the equivalent, making the case that this anticipates the Virgin Mary. Now, you may not agree with that, but that's what they were thinking at the time. They thought that you could go back into the ancient religions and find that they were, in a sense, prophesizing Christianity. And so anyway, but this is by far one of the most famous paintings. It's Botticelli at his best. And so Bellini, another contemporary, I started painting St. Francis in the desert. Of course, this doesn't particularly look like a desert, but you know who St. Francis is? He was a monk. He gave up all worldly stuff and spent his life, what you might say, communing with nature. And when you see St. Francis, he is almost always dressed like a monk. And sometimes you'll see him depicted, yes, Olivia.
What?
Oh, I thought you were
I was
asking a
just,
question.
it's really.
But you'll see him like with a bird on his shoulder, because he was an environmentalist before his time. He communed with nature, and he didn't kill animals or anything. He was really quite the pacifist and quite the environmentalist. And those of you who are Catholic, some of you who aren't, might recognize that this is the saint from which Pope Francis took his name. And for all of the same reasons, because he's the embodiment of those who give up worldly trappings and has respect and love for nature. And so we got, this is the Renaissance. This is Perugino, Christ delivering the keys of the kingdom to St. Peter. And you can see the perspective, vanishing point being here, not on Christ, Christ giving this, the keys to the kingdom. That's why in Christian belief, in Catholic belief, St. Peter is the person you have to talk to when, if and when you die and want to go to heaven. St. Peter lets you in or not. And so there's the keys to heaven. Look like a pretty big lock to me, but this is how they did it. Late 15th century. I got another painting that I'll show you sometime soon, and it'll be based on this, but as I was saying, the vanishing point is up here at the church door, not at Christ. And Mantegna, another notable painter at the end of the 15th century. And I'll show you this. This is when you're getting really good at perspective. When you can paint people looking down from the center of the dome as though they are on the roof and looking down upon you. And this was kind of a joke, actually, in a sort of a way. Camera picta, painted chamber. The chamber was a bedroom. And so this was kind of tongue-in-cheek that this young wife and young husband had this in their bedroom with painted images of people looking down on them. And so it was said that the woman was actually kind of embarrassed by all of this. But anyway, and Mantegna did all kinds of stuff with perspective. This is his big contribution. This is St. James led to martyrdom. And look where he's put the vanishing point, where the viewer is. Eye level line is right here. And so even though St. James is being led to martyrdom, we're still way below the activity. It's as though we look up to St. James. And that's him right here, and these are his jailers. And this is what this painting looked like before World War II. And I've got to add that there were many great artworks that were lost in the Second World War because of area bombing. A lot of things just got destroyed, and this among them. But you can see, and you will notice that this is St. James being led to martyrdom, but this is the guy who is responsible for his arrest by these guards, and he is doing what? He's pardoning this guy. I forgive you. You betrayed me. It's kind of a similar story to Pontius Pilate, Judas, and Christ. And this is something that Mantegna did too. This is, I put star on this one too. Foreshortening Christ, lamentation over the dead Christ, 1500. And you see that he's dead. And you see the open wounds, which was kind of a new and different thing. And the other thing that he's doing here is that he's throwing Christ forward, up in your face. No denying what has happened here. And all four of his wounds from the spikes that held him to the cross are there, visible. And so Signorelli, this is kind of another painting that will anticipate further works in the 16th century, most notably The Last Judgment by Michelangelo. And in this case, you see the angels, and they're protecting heaven. They're dressed in, as again, 16th century, 15th century suits of armor. And finally, what starts to happen? It happens in Italy, and it actually happens in Northern Europe too. We saw Shangar's, the Saint Anthony, being tormented by the demons. We see the Battle of 10 Nudes, and it too is an engraving. And there is this idea that art could be made, multiples, and could go out to people, and people could actually own these things. And the architecture, the crown jewel of Italian Renaissance architecture, Brunelleschi's dome. It was early in the century, 1420, 1436. And almost every time you see a picture of Florence, it's a picture of this. It represents Florence in the same kind of way that the arch represents St. Louis, if you will. It's a symbol. It's become more than what it is. It's an icon. Now, for a long time, nobody really understood how Brunelleschi did this. And it was the biggest dome in over 1,000 years. It was bigger than what the ancients had ever done. And so it was kind of trade secret stuff. Brunelleschi never let on how he got this done. But about a decade ago, art historians, archaeologists, and some other scholars went back and they reverse engineered this one too. And they figured out how he did make this dome. And so anyway, there it is. We know what the inside, what the outer shell looks like. We know how he got the timbers up this high. And Brunelleschi, he's like the architect of the early Renaissance. And I want you to notice something. This is a foundling hospital. You could call that an orphanage. And what's different about this is that there is some ornamentation here. These little low relief sculptures, but it's devoid of a lot of the ornamentation that we see in Gothic Europe. And in fact, a lot of what they did was based on mathematics and proportions. And so what you have here is that the columns are exactly the same width apart. The archways are perfect semicircles. You see, it's a three-story building. And you see above the equally spaced windows, you have a triangle, geometric. But geometry was everything. It was mathematics, it was reason. It wasn't so much about ornamentation. In fact, they flaunted reason over imagery, over decoration, ornamentation. And you see kind of the same thing. This is an interior of San Lorenzo, but Gothic Cathedral would have all kinds of stuff all over. And this is, by comparison, very austere. These are the pews, by the way. And that goes to something we talked about in the first World Art and Ideas. And that is that these churches originally did not have pews. And in fact, people basically stood for whatever ceremony, most often a mass. And they stood. This is a modern convention, as well as these kneelers here. And likely Stations of the Cross. But what we see with all of the statues and all of the ornamentation of the Gothic, it's gone away. This is Brunelleschi. Here's another, he's the guy that did the dome. Same thing. Brunelleschi, look at this chapel. This is like almost an antithesis of a Gothic cathedral. Equally spaced, windows, door with the triangular pediment, stained glass. But based on geometry, and this is Notre Dame at Rouen. And I put this in here to kind of give you an idea of what had changed in this century. And you see here, all of these statues, all of this ornamentation here, there. I mean, in the Gothic age, they hardly left any part of this undecorated. And the other part of this, and this is an important part, this is asymmetrical. You see, this side is very different from the other. Likewise on the bottom, that's all been destroyed here, but you see the difference. Austere, it's almost minimal compared to Gothic architecture. And here's some more Gothic architecture, just getting in on some details here. And you see pedestals, sculptures, figures, more figures across the top, across the doorway, more over here, lots of ornamentation in between. Very different. And that that Notre Dame, at Rouen, this same cathedral here. This will show up again in art history too. And Claude Monet actually painted Rouen Cathedral, actually painted it many, many times in his impressionistic style. But it's a landmark, it's important, but here you go. Brunelleschi, very different from this to that. And again, another building, proportionate, windows one above the other, the archways, all of this geometrically worked out. Again, and again, Alberti. And Leon Battista Alberti, you see, in this case, Santa Maria Novella, and that's actually the doorway that this is across from the baptistry, and this is where all of that, the day the universe changed was filmed, at least that part. But you see, the geometry is right out there in the open. The circles, the rectangles, the squares, the semicircles, and so on. It's not a bunch of saints and other biblical or historical figures. It's geometry. Again. And again. So that brings us up to this slideshow from the beginning. Ooh, I lost my page. There we go. Share screen. There we go. I think there we go. Slideshow from beginning. Okay, are you guys seeing what I'm seeing? Renaissance and Mannerism in Cinquecento, Italy. Should I take that as a yes?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Thank you. I'm flying blind on this side. And so, Rome, Renaissance, and Baroque monuments. And so here's where we get the High Renaissance. And a lot of people kind of give it a date of 1500 to 1520. That's not exactly accurate, but when we change from one century to the next, sometimes there's not this kind of sharp delineation. It is a process of evolution and discovery and advances and people that want to hang on to tradition. And in a lot of ways, life is still like that. In art, in politics, in literature, in all kinds of disciplines. And so, Leonardo, somebody talked about the creation of Adam. I know who that is now, and talked about Michelangelo being the best of the Mutant Ninja Turtles. Here's one of the other ones: Donatello, Leonardo, and Raphael. And so again, this is somebody who created cartoons, created characters, and they knew their art history. So anyway, Leonardo, one of the more celebrated artists, and his career is kind of unusual for an artist. And you see, this is called the Madonna of the Rocks, and this is Jesus, John the Baptist. This is the Madonna. And we think this is Saint Anne, Mary's sister. And so this is the Madonna. This is the standard, but it's very different, again, from what we had seen a century earlier. And one of the aspects of this particular piece is that Leonardo is playing around with creating a deep space here. And you can see it looks like a cave, and it looks like there's light coming from the back. You see he's doing a lot of things with the anatomy. The babies look kind of chubby, kind of like they have baby fat. And although they look like babies, they are still gesturing in an adult way, giving a blessing and prayer. And so here it is. This is a drawing for the Madonna child with St. Anne and the infant St. John the Baptist. And you can see a cartoon in the early 16th century just really meant a drawing. That's what they called drawings at the time, was cartoons. And it's usually a preparatory drawing that you would use pencil or charcoal on paper to work out what you would do when you created an oil painting, working out the anatomy, the composition, the lights and darks, and so on. So that's why it's called a cartoon, and we see the similarity, and Leonardo, he didn't make many paintings in his lifetime. He, for the most part, did other things. And he was a scientist, and he made a lot of discoveries. He invented a lot of things. And the painting was just kind of something that he approached with a scientific method as part of the painting. And so you can see, we see these perspective lines, and they kind of go right above the head of Jesus here, but the horizon line being way back there. This is one of the most iconic paintings in Western art history. And this is before it was restored. And it was in kind of bad shape. What happened is this. Leonardo was experimenting with creating new kinds of paint. He was experimenting with pigments and binders and solvents and so on to create better, richer, more pliable paints. And so what he did here, it says oil and tempera on plaster. That's kind of an unusual combination. You would put oil and tempera typically on wood, but this is on plaster, and he thought he could do that. And the sad thing is, it deteriorated. And this is more like what it looks like today. Here are the vanishing points, as I was talking about, and even included the door. This is actually at a monastery, and it is right at, you see, it's a refectory. It's right above what you would call a cafeteria. And so every day when these monks went in for their meal, they would see this painting of the Last Supper as a reminder of Jesus' life and so on. The Mona Lisa, we were talking about this earlier. We're talking about how small it was, 2 feet, 6 inches, 30 inches, 30 inches high, 21 across. Again, among the most celebrated works of Western art. That's why they call this the High Renaissance, because they advance from decade to decade, from artist to artist. They basically work towards greater naturalism, better proportions, deeper, more believable space, more believable skin, And so this is considered where they kind of reached that point collectively. And you see some of the subtle light that kind of denotes the folds in the dress, but not overly done. The soft shadows. And in fact, Leonardo had written about different kinds of shadows that would be cast. And so, like up here, this is a kind of a shadow. It's not that dark, but you see back here and under here, darker. And he studied the way light hit skin. And again, I was showing you the invented landscape behind that portrait by Botticelli. This is yet another invented landscape, and this is what they like to do. And they could make a landscape out of whole cloth, so to speak, and they knew about atmospheric perspective. Leonardo called it the perspective of transposing air, or atmospheric perspective. And that is that when things got farther away, they would get less distinct and they would be bluer in hue. And so the Mona Lisa. But here, I'm glad they included this in the book. Leonardo da Vinci, the fetus and the lining of the uterus. Amazing. Amazing anatomy. And in fact, he invented this cutaway view, as though you'd taken the uterus and pulled it out of a woman and then cut it and opened it up. It sounds kind of awful, and it is awful, but it was a very good way to describe anatomy. And even yet today, when you see anatomical drawings, oftentimes they'll use some of the same methods that Leonardo invented. And so you see the umbilical cord, you see the fetus and the fetal position, and it's just amazing. Did anybody go to the Leonardo show at the Science Center last year?
I feel like I did, but maybe it was a different art show. Like I remember, like in the theater.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That sounds right. I didn't get to go, and I am really sorry I missed it. I've seen a number of shows at the Science Center. King Tut's tomb was
Yeah, I saw that one.
spectacular. That
Yeah, I
was
saw that.
awesome. And so I heard the Leonardo was really good too, and he's darn. When you got grandkids and you're the primary babysitter. So I love them. I want you to see this too. The way this is written. He wrote backwards. All of his notes on scientific discoveries, inventions, anatomical stuff, he wrote backwards. And scholars believe that it's a ploy to keep other people from knowing exactly what it is or what it was he was up to. And so you could hold this up to a mirror, and if you spoke or could read Italian, it would make perfect sense. But the other thing I got to say here too is at this time, 16th century, we're running into an inflection point. And that inflection point is that the science is advancing. And what is happening as science advances, it comes into conflict with church teachings. And sometimes it's a direct conflict. Sometimes it's just, for instance, in this case, we know that Leonardo had grave robbers go get fresh corpses from the graveyard. And he would dissect those dead bodies. And that was how he was able to study human anatomy. Now, if he'd got caught with dead bodies, and that's desecrating the dead, that is messing with a person's soul, that is simply not done. And so a lot of this stuff had to be undercover. He had to be subversive. He had to kind of go underground, if you will, with a lot of this stuff. And he was so much in the crosshairs that he packed up and went to southern France. And at the time, the Catholic Church separated. They had a pope in southern France. They had a pope in Rome. Chaos. Anyway, he was daring, to say the least. Vitruvian Man, this is really another iconic drawing. And it's used to demonstrate, to some extent, the perfect proportions of the human body. And he's not the only one that's doing that. We'll see in the next chapter, Albrecht Dürer's doing some of the same things, but he tries to fit the human body into this square and the circle. And so you see the proportions, it's like, we still use some of this actually when you're being taught figure drawing. This is halfway up, halfway between the bottom of the feet. And this line here, right at the hips, the knees, et cetera, et cetera. Bottom line, a scientist, and had all kinds of inventions. He was an architect, a central plan for a church. And again, that writing backwards. And so, Brooke, what you got?
No, I'm trying to write it backwards.
Oh, yeah. Writing backwards is not easy.
It's not. I got stuck on the A.
Yeah,
I really did.
yeah, no kidding. And so, the second of these is Raphael. And this is the marriage of the Virgin. And this is very much like Perugino. Christ delivering the keys to the kingdom to St. Peter. As I told you a minute ago, we'll see another painting that's very similar. And again, the same vanishing point, same kind of perspective. What he has done is that he collapsed the sides of this. And so it's not that deep space you see in the earlier, and it's a different subject to be sure, but this is Mary, that's Joseph. And again, we see others in the picture, especially on this side, who are dressed like 16th century Italians. And again, the idea of the frame being maybe sometimes as elegant or as ornate or as artful as the painting itself holds true here. There it is. I thought I put this together. This is the Perugino. This is the Raphael. And so we got it again, the Madonna. And again, like some of the predecessors from the 15th century, and Leonardo as well, the babies are more baby-like. Everything is more human. We can trace this back to Fra Filippo Lippi. And again, the invented landscape. And so Madonna in the Meadow might be a good place to call it quits for today, because we got a lot of Raphael stuff to talk about. And once we get into it, it's kind of deep. So what I wanted to say to you was, as the beginning of this class, I had 10 submissions for quiz 1. You have until midnight to get that in, and I would encourage you to turn it in before midnight. I read through the ones that had been submitted, and I'm not going to comment on that, but we'll talk about your entries, your favorite works. We'll talk about that on Monday. So, any questions? Should I sing to you for the next 5 minutes?
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm here.
All right, well, we'll call it quits and have a safe weekend.